this is Runa and you're listening to the Changemakers podcast, where we share tips, insight, tools and stories from other changemakers designed to motivate you to become the change you want to see in your world. Make sure you join our Changemakers community at runamagnus.com/podcast. And now, this is your time to sit back, relax and enjoy. Meet my guest, Professor Gina Reppin. She is the Emeritus Professor of Cognitive Neuroimagining at the Aston Brain Centre at Aston University in Birmingham. She's the past president of the British Association of Cognitive Neuroscience and in 2015 was awarded an honorary fellowship of the British Science Association. Her research involved state-of-the-art brain imagining techniques to investigate developmental disorders such as dyslexia and autism. She has received fundings from the Medical Research Council, the Wellcome Foundation and the Nuffield Foundation, Economic and Social Sciences Research Council, Biological and Behavior Sciences Research Council. You can see I had to get Gina as a guest on our Changemakers podcast to have a dialogue with me and the co-creator of the No More Boxes movement, looking at, are we fighting windmills when we are offering people the opportunity to open up their gender boxes, take a look inside? Is that really who they were born to be, or are we all just what we are conditioned to be? Big questions. Fabulous woman that you will love and will get an aha moment or two listening to Gina Reppin. Here she goes. Gina Reppin, thank you so much for being willing to be a guest on the Changemakers podcast. And I'm so honored and so excited to have you with us.
Thank you very much for asking me.
You know, the whole thing that, and for our guests who are not looking at the video but are on listening to this episode, you will hear another voice, not just mine. You will hear Nicholas Haynes, the co-creator of the No More Boxes movement, who is also a host. He's the co-host of this episode. Gina, just to start off with, you wrote a book, The Gentle Brain, which was published last year, 2019. And now you're publishing another book that is The Genders and Our Brain. Am I correct?
Sorry, no, I'm afraid it's the same book. The American version, they changed the title.
They changed the title?
Yes.
That's what we were thinking about.
Well, they said, the publishers said the Americans couldn't cope with the term gendered, which, given my impression is they're a nation which spend all its time turning nouns into verbs. I was surprised that they wanted to call it Gender in Our Brains, and so I'm afraid it's the same book.
It's the same book. Okay, that explains it, because we were just thinking, what is really going to be different in that? Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So, can I just say I'm very glad it's the same book, because the book is utterly brilliant. So if we get the book going into a different market, whether it's called something, it's a brilliant, utterly brilliant.
Thank you. Well, the Spanish edition came out. Well, I'm actually going to Spain tomorrow, so there is a Spanish edition out. So it's getting out there, which is why I wrote it. So that's
yeah, exactly. So just going into that topic, we are building this movement, the No More Boxes movement, and one of the big boxes that we are opening up is the gender box. Mm-hmm. And what we are experiencing is this resistance to really open it up and look at who are we as human beings. Mm-hmm. So my first question is, how can we use the information from your book in a way that opens up people's minds to who are we as human beings?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. And actually it's all to do with some of the fundamental issues seem trivial, and that's, are we actually talking about sex or are we talking about gender? And I think if you look at the use of the word over time, the term sex used to apply the biological sex and what was then felt to be the inevitable downstream consequences, what kind of personality and temperament and skills you had, and what kind of job you could do, and therefore what role you had in society. And sex was actually used for all of those stages. So we talked about sex roles, for example. We've now shifted, I think in the 1980s, probably coinciding with the second wave of feminism, the term gender was introduced to kind of say there's some biological aspects, but there's also some social aspects. The argument then was that they were completely separate. But now we use the term gender in the same way that the term sex used to be used. So we talk about gender pay gaps and even gender reveal parties. And I think that is an indication that there is still this misunderstanding or still an assumption that one thing is inextricably linked to the other. So when you say to people, you can be any gender you like, people will say, but I'm male or female, and, I'm either one or the other, and therefore there can only be two genders. And that is very much the terms in which the debate is currently going on. So hopefully explaining to people that this, what looked like an inextricable link, isn't. We're not hardwired by our genotypes in a particular way, could allow people to think, I don't only have to identify myself as man or woman and everything else that goes with that.
And it is the everything else that goes with it that I think is kind of at the nub of one of the problems, isn't it? The gender and everything else goes with it. Well, you know what men are like. Men are like this. Women are like this. Men are from Mars, or right. Which way around? Where are men? Men are from some planet. So it's the everything that goes with it is where some of our experience and some of the things we're seeing. So, can you talk about the everything that goes with it?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I mean that brings us into the role of the stereotypes, gender stereotypes, which is where the title of the book eventually arrived at. Because my basic premise, which when people say, so if you think men's and women's brains aren't different, you must think they're the same. And I'll say, no, that is not the consequence of what I think. I actually think every brain is different from every other brain. And that's what we should be looking at. How do brains get to be different? And I did actually want to call the book 50 Shades of Grey Matter, but the publishers thought perhaps that wasn't quite serious.
Gina, what a title.
Yeah, what a title, exactly. Yeah.
But I think that's it. It's the idea that, and I think it's even more emphasized in the 21st century by marketing and all sorts of things. The idea is that if you're male, then that you are all of these things. Or if you're female, then you're all of these things, and they're different. And the list inevitably is attached to whether you're male or female. And I think getting people to understand that, for example, just because you're a woman doesn't mean you're automatically empathic, in the same way that just because you're a man doesn't mean you're automatically brilliant at reading maths, for example. But it's comfortable. That stereotypes are shortcuts, and everybody's got a brain, everybody's got a sex of some kind and a gender of some kind, and their lived experience suggests that thinking in those binary terms has been all right so far, in inverted commas, and the all right in inverted commas. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of argument. But people do get very aggravated and annoyed if you say, this past certainty, which has been with us for a very long time, science suggests that this is actually not the case.
And I think there's quite an interesting one. Sorry, Rooney, can I just quickly do this?
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Because I think it's sometimes some of the thing when we're looking at when a study comes out and says, oh, there is a difference in terms of the scientific view of a difference and our society. Well, there is a difference.
At last, the truth. Yeah.
Yeah, and it backs up my paradigm. There is and could you just talk just very briefly about that? And
yes, I think that's really
interesting.
There does seem to be a very profound need to hold on to that clear-cut difference. It's comfortable, and it is the case that as a neuroscientist, if you sort of come across a whiff of a sex difference in the brain in some obscure journal, you can bet within a month or so there will be an at last the truth or proof at last headline in the public media. If somebody does a study, and of course, mainly they won't have been published, so you may have come across data where people looked very hard for differences and didn't find them. They don't get into the popular press as, at last the truth, men and women aren't that different after all. So there is clearly a strong need for that, and I think that's part of the pushback. But it is, I think particularly with revolutions in science, where they're going back and saying, we don't just want to find out when you did find a difference. It could be as important or even more important where you didn't find a difference. And I think if you look back in the history of sex difference research, particularly brain neuroscience research, somebody recently did a study which said the number of significant differences which have been found cannot have been possible in terms of the sample sizes that people were using. So clearly people are cherry picking the differences, and that's what they report. That's what people are looking for. And so you get this overwhelming impression that scientists are actually catching up with what the rest of the world knew all the time, that men and women are different. But so I think there's that aspect. But the other aspect, particularly with respect to neuroscience, is that, we've spent decades of research, thousands of taxpayers' dollars, looked and, there's a huge array of publications showing that there are sex differences in this part of the brain or that part of the brain. But another paper will come along and say, oh, we didn't find any sex differences here, but we did find them there. So we get these intense arguments about where the differences are. But actually, as neuroscientists, we don't even know what those mean. I mean, somebody could have a thicker cortex or a bigger amygdala or a, bigger bridge of fibers joining the two hemispheres. But, it isn't an anatomical argument. It's really saying, if we're interested in gender and gender gaps and individual differences, actually spending all our time looking at little parts of the brain is not very informative.
And that difference might be a statistical difference, but there's no difference in our experience in reality. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, and we're always talking about groups because people, scientists forget that people reading their work are not necessarily scientists. So they don't always draw attention to the fact that you've got two sets of data from men and women. They're distributed, possibly showing a huge amount of variability within each group. But what you do is focus on the tiny differences between them. But the data sets themselves are hugely overlapping. So, if you've got something like a 90% overlap on the size of a particular part of the brain between males and females, it may be statistically significant. It could be very small, but it means that knowing somebody is a male or a female is not informative in terms of understanding what the size of that part of the brain is going to be. And I think people have missed that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We talk about it that we are doing this to save some brain calories, but it's really, there's no need of keeping people in those gender boxes and just make them suffocate there and not giving them access to really who they were born to be. Mm-hmm. Which leads me to the question, can we change this? Can this be changed?
I think, the conversation has started, and actually a lot of it is to do with gender identity and the ongoing debate, in trenchant terms in some cases, about, can children, for example, feel that they're a boy rather than a girl? A whole load of issues certainly in the UK, about this whole issue of gender assignment and whether you can self-declare. So I think it's a kind of messy argument at the moment, but at least the argument is there. So I think the idea that who you feel you are is not necessarily tied to your biological components. And I think that's a way of starting to open these boxes because, as people say, well, what's wrong with, vive la différence, let boys be boys kind of thing. Yeah. And you say, well, if you look at the mental health statistics, depression in women, eating disorders, self-harm, high levels of suicide rates in young men, then whatever the destination is that people are being led to is not positive for everybody. So we really need to look at the journey which takes them there and say, is it really the case that if you're born a female, this is what you're going to be like? You won't be welcome in these kind of professions or disciplines. You'll be expected to be like this, to look like this, etc. And you could say, if everybody was happy with that, well, let's leave well alone. But it's clear that's not the case, as well as all of the other sort of social justice and gender inequality issues which need tackling.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that we're coming really to the end of this short but very, very, very valuable podcast episode. What is next for you, Gina?
Well, I think I am exploring the idea that I do start, in fact, it's much more to do with my own research, to look at the consequences of, the downstream consequences of gender stereotypes on the brain. So this is how it works in the world, as it were. But I will then focus in on autism in girls, depression in women, self-harm, coercive control, to say, this is the really pathological consequences. So I need to recover from writing the last one, I think. My family probably needs to recover from me writing the last one.
and I think that would be a really interesting, because I think Runa's question was saying kind of, can we see this changing? But so can we see this changing as within us as individuals? But can we also see this changing within society, that we get away from men are like this and women are like this?
And also noting the kind of self-fulfilling prophecy aspect of these stereotypes. So I'm talking to a lot of diversity groups who are setting up diversity initiatives, and say we always focus on the individual. This woman needs lots more training, or that man needs some kind of anger management or something. But you could say, well, actually, let's have a look at the culture within which they're functioning. There's no point giving an individual lots and lots of encouragement to go into science, for example, and she goes into science, and science doesn't think women can be scientists or be successful, or if they are successful, it's due to all sorts of other factors. So it's a waste of our time focusing on the individual. So just need to change, the world.
That's what we're doing. One step at a time. Exactly. And we're definitely doing that with help of a researcher and scientist like yourself, Gina.
Thank you.
Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for all the things that you're doing to the world, and helping us to understand how we can feel safe and valued for who we were born to be, not who we were conditioned to be.
Okay, good way of putting it. Thank you.
Was this podcast of value for you? I sure hope so. If so, feel free to share the love and give us your generous review on iTunes or Stitcher. And remember that you can always go to runamagnus.com to find out more about the Changemakers and how we can help you drive the change you want to see in your world.